This first series of videos will introduce analytic philosophy. Now, I should say right off the bat, it's controversial exactly what analytic philosophy is. There's a variety of ways you can think about analytic philosophy. Some people think of analytic philosophy as a movement among a series of other movements in the history of philosophy. So you can think of it like this. There was ancient philosophy, and then at some later point, there was medieval philosophy, and then at some later point, there was early modern philosophy, and then at some later point, there was analytic philosophy. And that's the sort of stage we're in now. So analytic philosophy is sort of describing a period. Another way you can think of analytic philosophy is as the result of a kind of schism in philosophy. So you might think that Western philosophy, at any rate, if not all philosophy, kind of went along doing its thing, and then there was a split, and some philosophers decided to do things one way, and other philosophers decided to do things another way. Those are analytic and continental philosophers, and all philosophy can be sort of pushed into one of those two groups. Another way you might think of analytic philosophy is as a particular method for doing philosophy, and you might think, given that way of thinking about it, some ancient Greek philosophers were analytic philosophers, some medieval philosophers were analytic philosophers, some early modern philosophers were analytic philosophers, and so on. That is, it's a kind of philosophy that could be done in any historical period. There's all sorts of different ways of thinking about what analytic philosophy is. I'm going to offer one way of thinking about it because it's often sort of at the center of a history of analytic philosophy course, and because it makes sense of this label here, analytic. So throughout the course, we'll offer other ways of thinking about what analytic philosophy is. This is just going to be sort of our starting point. So here's the unifying idea. Philosophy should focus on analyzing language. Now, there's a kind of bold version of this idea, which says philosophy is nothing but the analysis of language. That is, all there is to philosophy is analyzing language. And there's a more modest version of this, which says that analyzing language is central to philosophy, even if philosophy does a bit more. We'll focus on the bold version of this idea. You could get to the modest version by accepting a lot of the motivation for the bold version, but thinking that it goes too far. Okay, so why would anybody think that philosophy just is the analysis of language? There's two motivations that we'll talk about, and then a third, which is kind of a mixture of the first two. So the first motivation is this. You might think that philosophical statements are analytic. Now, I'll explain what it is for a statement to be analytic and why someone who thinks that philosophical statements are analytic would end up thinking that philosophy just is the analysis of language momentarily. Second, you might think that philosophical problems are just misunderstandings of language. And again, I'll explain in a little bit why anybody would think that that's true and what exactly it means. Then there's a third option, which is this, that some combination of the first two is right. So this would hold that while many philosophical statements are analytic, not all are, and while many philosophical problems are misunderstandings based on language, not all are, but any philosophical problem is solved either by identifying the correct analytic statements or by showing how the problem isn't really a problem and arises through misunderstanding language. We'll just talk about the first two. So philosophical statements are analytic. First off, why would anybody think that philosophical statements are analytic, and what is it for a statement to be analytic? Now, there's a variety of different ways of thinking about analyticity. We'll talk about some of these ways throughout the course, but we're going to start with a kind of simple version of analyticity, which says this. A statement is analytic if and only if its meaning alone determines its truth value. So whether it's true or false is determined by its meaning, not by anything independent of its meaning, not by anything, say, out there in the world. So if this is right, then if a statement is analytic, then its meaning determines whether it's true or false. So consider some examples. Dogs are dogs. What makes that true? It is true, but what makes it true? Well, is it a fact about dogs themselves that makes it true that dogs are dogs? Or is it just a fact about the language, about what the statement means? Plausibly, I'm not saying this is correct, but plausibly, it's just a fact about what the statement means. So dogs are dogs is made true by the meaning of dogs are dogs. You might think the same thing holds for sisters or siblings. Sisters or siblings is made true by the meaning of the sentence. That is, once you've fixed the meaning of the sentence, sisters or siblings, you've determined that the sentence is true. You don't need any sort of facts out there in the world independent of what the sentence means to make it true. Bachelors are unmarried. Again, you might say the same thing here. It's made true by the meaning of the sentence. You don't need to go find some facts about bachelors in order to make the sentence true. That is, those facts about bachelors themselves aren't what makes this true. What makes this true is the meaning of the sentence. And you might think the same thing holds for a sentence like this. 4 is less than 5. It's made true by its meaning. Or this, forests have plants. It's made true by its meaning. Now, the way we're using the word analytic, not every analytic sentence is true. Some analytic sentences are false because their meaning will determine that they're false. So examples, dogs are not dogs. That's not made true by the nature of dogs. It's made true by the meaning of the sentence. So the idea goes. Sisters are not siblings. Same thing. The meaning of the sentence makes it false. Bachelors are married. Again, the meaning of the sentence makes it false. And again, just to be clear, I'm not saying it's actually the case that the meaning of the sentence makes it false. I'm saying that's what would be true if it were analytic, and this is plausibly the kind of sentence that's analytic if any sentence is. 4 is more than 5, made false by its meaning. Forests have no plants, made false by its meaning. Now, this conception of analyticity that we're working with here is sometimes called the metaphysical conception. It talks about or defines analyticity in terms of what makes a sentence true or false. If the meaning makes it true, it's analytic. If the meaning makes it false, it's analytic. If something else makes it false, like, say, the way the world is, then it's not analytic. It might be helpful to have a contrast here. So let's look at sisters are siblings. Contrast sisters are siblings with sisters are friendly. No one would think that the meaning of the sentence, sisters are friendly, makes it true. If it's true at all, what makes it true is facts about sisters, their being friendly. And if it's false, what makes it false is facts about sisters, some of them being unfriendly. That seems very different than sisters are siblings, which plausibly is just made true by the meaning. Now that's, again, the metaphysical conception of analyticity. There's also an epistemic conception, which says that a sentence is analytic if and only if its truth value can be determined by, that is, you can discover its truth value by investigating its meaning. And plausibly, if these sentences are analytic in the metaphysical sense, they're also analytic in the epistemic sense. So, dogs are dogs, plausibly, you can know that that's true just by reflecting on its meaning. You don't need to go out and look at dogs and check them out to figure out whether that's true. You can know it's true just by thinking about what it means. The same thing for sisters or siblings. Plausibly, you can know that's true just by reflecting on what it means. You don't need to go out and check sisters to see if they're siblings, like go to a sister and be like, hey, are you a sibling? You can just think, oh yeah, sisters are siblings. Same thing for each of these. Let's look at the bottom one. Forests have plants. The idea is if you know what a forest is, that is, if you understand what a forest is, then you understand what a plant is, and you understand what having is, and you understand the syntax of the sentence, which is to say, if you know what this sentence means, then you know that it's true. You don't need to go look in the world, find some forests, and check whether they have plants. All you need to do is reflect on the meaning of forests have plants to see that it's true. And similarly, all you need to do to see that forests have no plants is false is reflect on its meaning. Okay, that's analyticity. We're focusing on, again, on the metaphysical conception, which says a statement is analytic if and only if its meaning alone determines its truth value. All right, here's an argument. If a statement is analytic, then the best way to find its truth value is to identify its meaning. This, of course, is pretty plausible. If it's made true by its meaning, then it makes sense that you would find whether it's true or false by checking its meaning. Now, suppose it's the case that all philosophical statements are analytic. Why would you think that's true? We'll talk about that in a minute, but for now, let's just suppose it's the case that all philosophical statements are analytic. Well, according to 1, if a statement is analytic, then you find its truth value by identifying its meaning. 2 says philosophical statements are analytic, so it follows, this is just indicating that 1 and 2 are what get us here, that the best way to find the truth value of any philosophical statement is to identify its meaning. Now, since this is the first video, I should say, when I represent an argument, I often number the premises of the argument and then have the rationale for that premise in brackets on the side. When there's numbers on the side, it just means it comes from those earlier premises. So we have this conclusion that the best way to find the truth value of any philosophical statement is to identify its meaning. Now all we need to do is add this. The job of philosophy is to identify the truth value of each philosophical statement. That seems intuitively pretty plausible. It would make sense that that's what philosophy should be doing. So if we have the best way to find the truth value of any philosophical statement is to identify its meaning, and the job of philosophy is to identify the truth value of each philosophical statement, it follows that the best way to do what philosophy should be doing is to identify the meaning of each philosophical statement. So we now have that the best way to do the job of philosophy is to identify the meaning of each philosophical statement. Well, identifying the meaning of a statement just is analyzing language, that's obvious. So we put 5 and 6 together. 5 says the best way to do philosophy is to identify the meaning of each philosophical statement. 6 says you do that by analyzing language. So it follows that the best way to do philosophy is to analyze language. And it's a short step from there to this conclusion that philosophy just is analyzing language. So that's how we get from the claim that philosophical statements are analytic to the claim that philosophy just is the analysis of language. We add in an obvious claim in number 1, then we draw a conclusion. Then we add in an intuitive claim with number 4, and we add in an obvious claim with number 6, and that gets us to philosophy just is the philosophy of language. So we can think of the claim that philosophy just is the analysis of language as a conclusion from this argument. Starts with the premise that philosophical statements are analytic, leads to the conclusion that philosophy just is the analysis of language. Now, in order to really begin to understand this argument and begin to find reason to endorse this argument, you would need to know why someone would think that philosophical statements are analytic, and we'll talk about that in the next video. But now let's turn to the second motivation for the claim that philosophy just is the philosophy of language, the analysis of language, and it's that philosophical problems are just misunderstandings of language. So here's the idea. The job of philosophy is to solve philosophical problems. That seems pretty intuitive. Philosophical problems arise from misunderstanding language. Well, that might not seem so intuitive. We'll defend that claim later, but suppose we have that on board. It follows from 1 and 2 that the job of philosophy is to clear up problems that arise from misunderstanding language. The best way to clear up problems that arise from misunderstanding language is to analyze language. That seems pretty obvious. Well, if the job of philosophy is to clear up problems that arise from misunderstanding language, and the best way to clear up such problems is to analyze language, then philosophy just is the analysis of language. So we get this conclusion from 3 and 4. Again, we start with the claim that philosophical problems are misunderstandings of language, and we add in an intuitive claim and an obvious claim, and it gets us to the conclusion that philosophy just is the analysis of language. So there's 2 arguments that lead to the conclusion that philosophy is the analysis of language. You might think that you can combine these 2. That's fine. But the motivations for the claim that philosophy just is the analysis of language will stay largely the same. So we're going to stop this video there. I'm always going to try and keep the videos under 15 minutes. In the next video, we're going to consider why anybody would think that philosophical statements are analytic. And in the video after that, we'll consider why anybody would think that philosophical problems are just misunderstandings of language. Okay, so we'll stop there.